stunning mid-air drama over Black Sea. Russian fighter collides with US drone. Putin's pilots hunt and kill US predator. US labels Russian pilots unprofessional. Russia denies, says US drone provoked. What's the truth of the deadly drone drama? Top focus on India First.
This is being seen as a huge flare-up and the first direct contact between Russian and US military assets, with the US accusing Russia of first blocking and then downing a US MQ-9 Reaper unmanned aerial vehicle. The question is, will this lead to an escalation and retaliatory action by the United States? The US has called Russian action as reckless, but as Russia sent out a very clear and a very sharp message to the NATO alliance. Russia is expanding the scope of this conflict. Has Russia sent out a very sharp message and yet kept it in the grey zone? First by dumping fuel on the drone and then tipping it over, sending it crashing down into the Black Sea, instead of using an air-to-air missile to bring down an American drone. I'm Gaurav Sawant. We'll get you reactions from Moscow, we'll get you reactions from Kiev and a perspective from the national capital. But first, as always, the headlines. Day 3 of Parliament logjam over Rahul Gandhi's democracy remark. BJP continues to demand an apology. Gandhi's most trusted aide Sam Petroda speaks out, says, give the Congress MP some space. "18 opposition parties march to the Enforcement Directorate from Parliament, demand investigation into the Adani crisis. TMC and NCP skip the opposition show of strength. Rahul Gandhi lands in India, but no show at the march." K. Kavita's plea against the Enforcement Directorate summons quashed by the Supreme Court. BRS MLC to be questioned by the agency in the Liquorgate probe tomorrow. Former Bihar Chief Minister Lalu Prasad Yadav and family get bail after CBI says it has no objection. Next hearing on the 29th of March. Interim relief for former Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan from a park court. Police ordered to stop operations outside his Zaman Park residence. Order on his bail plea reserved for now. The United States has accused Russia of bringing down a US MQ-9 Reaper surveillance drone flying in the international airspace on the Black Sea. The US claimed 2 Russian fighter jets, Su-27s, first flew in front of the American drone, then dumped fuel on it, and finally, according to the Americans, the Russian Su-27 clipped the drone with a wingtip, damaging the propeller of that drone, sending it crashing down into the Black Sea. The US has called Russian action unsafe and unprofessional. Russia, of course, insists that there was no contact and it was an unguided American drone that went into tailspin and crashed. But has Russia sent out a very clear message to the US and NATO countries that Russia is willing to expand the scope of this conflict? Shiv Arur with our top story.
The stealthy high-altitude spy, an American MQ-9 Reaper drone flying silently over the Black Sea. The hunter, a pair of Russian Air Force Sukhoi Su-27 fighter jets. Advanced aircraft of enemy superpowers in a deadly tango off the coast of Ukraine. The American drone pilotless, the Russian jets flown by the best fighter pilots in that country. And then In what is possibly the most hostile theatre in the world today, the unthinkable happens. One of the Russian Su-27s first jettisons fuel onto the American drone and then gently collides with it, destroying the drone's propeller and sending it into a deep dive straight into the Black Sea. In a matter of minutes, a $100 million drone, the cream of American strategic power, is toast. According to the US military, reckless and unprofessional Russian pilots lost control of their jets and rammed into the American drone after dumping fuel onto it.
Based on the actions of the Russian pilots, it's clear that it was unsafe, unprofessional, and I think the actions speak for themselves. What we saw again were fighter aircraft dumping fuel in front of this UAV, and then getting so close to the aircraft that it actually damaged the propeller on the MQ-9. Because of the damage, we were in a position to have to essentially crash it into the Black Sea.
Russia, on its part, has denied all allegations being leveled by the Pentagon, but hasn't offered a separate version, only accusing the United States of flying the drone in a provocative manner and demanding an explanation for the incident. Now you might be wondering why the Russian Su-27s would need to conduct the dangerous business of colliding with a drone to destroy it. Surely Su-27 fighters fly armed with air-to-air missiles, right? While this is certainly true, it's also a fact that a missile fired at a US drone at this time would have been interpreted as an act of war and triggered an unpredictable escalation. This is something Russia definitely is aware of, and that's why experts believe the Russian pilots needed to improvise a dangerous mid-air assault on the American drone without the use of weapons. The MQ-9 drone is about half the length of the Su-27 and much lighter than the fighter, but it has a larger wingspan. Any mid-air touch, even minor, is always a huge risk to both aircraft. Therefore, if the Russian pilots indeed deliberately dumped fuel onto the drone to paralyze its systems and then delicately edged just close enough to tap and destroy the drone's rear-mounted propeller, they knew it would be enough to bring the MQ-9 down. One section of experts contradicts the American suggestion that this was unprofessional warfare and insist it's actually exceptional skill demonstrated by the Russian pilots, especially since the fighters returned safely to their Russian bases. The fog of war means the details of what precisely happened at 20,000 feet may never fully be known, but the incident has sparked renewed tensions between the United States and Russia. Will the US now look to bring down a Russian aircraft in revenge? We'll be watching this space. Bureau Report, India Today.
Which brings us to our question of the day. Is this incident a major escalation? Does it bring Russia and the United States directly in conflict? Is Russia sending out a message to the United States 1 year into the Russia-Ukraine conflict that it's willing to expand the scope of this conflict? Before I bring in our guests, we are just getting a reaction from Russia, which is saying that the drone flew with its transponders off, violating the boundaries of the temporary airspace regime established for the special military operations communicated to all users of international airspace. Let me bring in our guests. Joining me from Kiev is Oleksiy Goncharenko, Member of Parliament, Ukraine. He joins us from Kiev. Prokhor Teben is the head of the International Defense and Military Economy Studies at the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at Moscow. Also with me is Lieutenant General Syed Atta Hasnain, someone who's watching this Russia-Ukraine conflict very, very closely as a military analyst here. But my first question is to India Today's Shiv Arur. Shiv, what is the assessment as of now? Is this a major escalation in conflict, even though Russia claims its fighters did not come in contact with the American drone?
Gaurav, there's no doubt at all that this is a very, very serious incident. Whether it's going to lead to an escalation, it certainly has diplomatically. On the ground, we'll have to see in the days ahead, what the escalation really manifests as. But, for an advanced drone to be, allegedly disrupted by reckless flying by the Russians, bad enough such that it had to be crashed into the Black Sea, is a huge deal. These are drones worth millions of dollars. They are the very creme de la creme of the strategic power of the United States. These are drones that are operated from thousands of kilometers away and represent the real strength of the United States. And remember, this was an MQ-9 Reaper, which is an armed variety of the Predator drone. So losing one of these is has an array of implications, not least, not just the loss of such an asset, but also the fact that such an asset could fall into the wrong hands. It could be reverse engineered by Russia or China. It could fall into Iran's hands. All of those implications are already there. Now, the Russians say none of the things that the Americans are alleging actually happened.
Yes.
They say that this was a provocative flight by this MQ-9 and it was engaged, and the Americans are making up stories. There are experts, Gaurav, who believe that this was actually exceptionally skillful flying by the Russians, because they know that if they didn't have the opportunity to fly, fire an air-to-air missile from the aircraft, from the Su-27s, the only option they had to bring that aircraft down was to conduct this very dangerous series of maneuvers to actually collide with that aircraft and bring it down after dumping fuel on it. So they obviously improvised. We can call it, the use of Jugaad air power to bring down a drone, but the implications will be felt. I'm sure the United States will have to retaliate at a time and place of their choosing, whether it is against air assets, whether it is vicariously through the war against, the war in Ukraine. We don't know that just yet. But the United States obviously will not take this lying down. The implications will be there very plainly for the world to see very soon.
Shiv, stay with me. Let me get in a voice from Kiev on this. Alexei Goncharenko, how does Kiev view this development? Is this a signal from Moscow to the United States and NATO allies, sir?
No, I think this is a provocation from Russian side they try to escalate, they try to engage United States to some kind of reaction. Because, first of all, we should answer the question, did American US drone have a right to be there and to fly over the international waters? Yes, the answer is yes. They have this right, and it was not violating anything. So this drone had all the right to be there. So why Russia did it, and he did it now? I think that Russia now is looking for some kind of a victory, because they don't have any successes on the battleground in Ukraine from July of last year, so it soon will be 1 year. And that's why they tried to use this as a kind of to show Russian people that are still capable to do something, like, for example, to shut down this drone. But we just need to understand that the United States has more than 200 of such drones. So from the military point of view, that will change absolutely nothing. So that was just a game for Russian people, and also a provocation trying to engage United States more to the war.
Mr. Prokhor Tevin, the US described Russian actions as unsafe, unprofessional, and according to the Americans, demonstration of poor competence of the Russian pilots. What's your assessment from Moscow?
Thank you. I believe that it was not unprofessional. This situation is, of course, a significant incident, but quite a minor one. I believe that there would be no very significant escalation or consequences, but it was a clear message and a signal from Russian side to the American one about keeping United States well away from Russian borders and from the zone of military operation.
So it's a clear signal. It's telling the Americans stay away from the battle zone, don't get involved more directly. General Hasnain, This has happened. Very provocative flying. It's happened between America and China. A Chinese pilot was killed. An American pilot was held hostage by the Chinese for some time. But in this context, has Russia actually sent out a clear message to the US that Moscow is willing to escalate and expand the scope of the conflict?
Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you for having me on your program today. It's a very interesting discussion which is going on. Let me take you back a couple of years. It's not necessary, first of all, that an escalation will always take place. I may differ slightly with my friend Shiv Aru's assessment.
Okay.
I take you back to the 50s when the U-2 was shot down. You know, when it took off spying over the former Soviet Union, and no escalation subsequently took place. We have had similar incidents with US armed forces all over the world. The USS Pueblo was taken over by the North Koreans way back in 1968. It didn't lead to any escalation. It's not necessary the escalation itself will take place. We do not have an aviation expert on our panel, but I'm led to believe that there cannot be an occasion when an aircraft is hit by another aircraft and both the aircraft do not suffer. If one of the Russian aircrafts appears to have both landed safely, and that seems to be a very implausible kind of a thing that a contact at all took place.
Okay.
The truth is the biggest casualty here. We will never be able to come to know as to what really happened in this particular case. But both sides obviously are on tenterhooks at the moment. To my mind, the Americans will not escalate for a simple reason. They've got other areas to look at. They've got the Indo-Pacific, they've got the Middle East to look at. They are not wanting to get involved in a direct conflict with Russia here.
Okay.
Proxy war is their concept, and that is what they will continue to execute.
Okay, so we had an aviation expert on our panel. We're having an issue with his link. Hopefully he will join us in a short while from now. But Mr. Gorcharenko, Moscow insists the Reaper flew with its transponders switched off. Moscow insists that the drone was violating boundaries of the temporary airspace regime established for what Moscow describes as a special military operation, and insists there was no contact, no onboard weapons were used. The drone went into an unguided flight and crashed. Is truth perhaps then the casualty, with two conflicting versions of the same incident, as the general points out?
Yeah, it's very interesting that inside Russia, Russian propaganda is trying to show it as a kind of a victory, but outside Russia, they're saying, we didn't attack the drone, we didn't want anything bad. So they are really scared of the United States of America, and we see it again in their reaction and trying officially to get their hands free of all this stuff. Speaking about the occupied territory that it is closed and so on, that was 100 kilometers from Crimea, which is Ukraine, and which is the legally occupied territory of Ukraine according to all international law and according to almost all members of United Nations, in just several who are supporting Russia. It's Northern Korea, Syria, Venezuela, that's all.
Okay.
And so this is Ukrainian territory. American drone was not violating anything, and that is absolutely clear. So again, but also what is interesting that after this, Turkey gave a permission to U.S. military ships to enter the Black Sea.
Yes.
To take the rest of these drones. It's interesting because Russian military ships are not allowed to enter the Black Sea. So the result of this Russian provocation is that American ships entered the Black Sea, which is definitely not what Russia was looking for.
That's a very interesting perspective you have on that, sir. Prokhor Tevin, is Moscow sending some kind of a message to US and NATO? Is Moscow expanding the scope of this conflict? Or are there two different versions coming out, celebrating internally and washing its hands off internationally?
We all know that such mission of this drone was quite military one, and we know that now the United States and NATO are fighting against Russia using Ukrainian forces as a proxy, and the mission of the drone was a reconnaissance one to obtain military information and data, which would be then processed to Ukrainian side to use for hits against Russian military and civilian targets in Crimea. So I think it was not a provocation, it was a long awaited for signal for American side.
Okay, General Hasnain, if a US drone has been brought down, does it close the door for a negotiated settlement or open a window for talks? Escalation perhaps would suit neither NATO, as you put it, nor Russia at this stage.
See, Gaurav, although this incident is definitely a very serious incident, I tend to believe that we are still at a very early stage of the escalatory ladder. And although in the context of Ukraine, we are not seeing any kind of movement towards negotiations as such, although I'm told some kind of a back channel is on at all times, but something which is more visible is just not there at the moment. I don't foresee the possibility that this particular incident will act as a dampener on that as such.
Okay.
To my mind, this will probably be treated, it will be treated in the next 2 days as a very, very serious incident, 48 hours, everyone will take cognizance of it. But at the end of it, after lots of strong messaging, etc., this is going to be relegated to the background. And I don't think there is going to be any kind of a retaliation or an escalation, because both sides are abundantly looking at calibration. They have reached the end of their tether. You're finding all along the front, except for a few hotspots where the battles are going on at the moment, both sides are short of resources. And I don't think they are in a position to immediately get into a retaliatory mode.
Alexei Goncharenko, is that also your assessment as a member of parliament who's currently in Kiev? Is Russia likely to escalate? Is this one of those escalations ahead of that proposed spring offensive? Is Moscow warning US to refrain from flying close to Crimea? But do you see that this will escalate, or will it lead to some kind of de-escalation?
Definitely Russia escalated by this. That was their decision to make this provocation. What is standing behind this? I still think that the most important for them was it was made for internal use, to show some kind of success, because Russian people are asking. They were told for so many years that Russian army is the second strongest in the world, blah, blah, blah. And now, like it was said by your guest from Moscow, that is the war of NATO. But sorry, there is no one soldier of NATO on Ukrainian soil. Ukrainians are fighting for ourselves. Yes, with support of Western weaponry, but you can't win the war against Ukraine, which was like they were saying that they would do it in several days. Now it's the second year of the war. So they just desperately need some kind of successes, which they decided to show with a drone, which is quite not so dangerous for them, because there is no pilot injured and so on. So they used a drone in an attempt to show some success. That's all what I think. That was the main reason for them.
Okay, Prokhor Tevin, is there an apprehension the US will strike back? Do you see an escalation? What can you tell us about this 500,000 people apparently being amassed in Russia for an offensive against Ukraine?
I don't believe that there would be significant escalation right now. New offensive will be, I think, in the coming months, and American side will continue to produce weapons for Ukrainian side, and the business will go on and on like it was before. But of course, I think the new actions will be made on both sides, and a desperately needed peace negotiations, I think, are far away, and we will see a lot of continuing fighting on both sides. That's all.
General, is that also your assessment, that there will be continued fighting? In fact, there will be escalation in the months ahead. The Western countries will continue to arm Ukraine, and this fight will only escalate.
Absolutely. That is exactly my assessment. The intensity of the fighting will be dynamic. It will go up and down. I do believe that in the coming months, just after the spring, there may be an intensive phase. It will probably come down to a much lower intensity after some time. You see, the resource availability to both sides is not something which is unending.
Okay.
We are seeing Europe actually is run out of reserves. The Russian side itself is running out of reserves at the moment. The military, it will all ultimately depend on the military-industrial complex of both the blocks, the Russian side and the American NATO side, as to how they can sustain this conflict. But I do believe that there will be phases in this war in which activity will come down to almost minimal. Those are the windows which will need to be exploited to look for negotiations and possibly look for some kind of a peace dividend coming out of this.
But are either side keen on those peace dividends, and if so, what's the road ahead? We will continue to track that story closely. Alexei Goncharenko, Member of Parliament from Ukraine, Mr. Tevin from Moscow for joining us here, and Janlata Hasnain, as always, many thanks.